The most exotic part of our expedition was the network of allegedly Etruscan rock-cut roads. Actually, we don't know if they are roads, but at least most of them do look like that, so I will continue referring to them as roads, although at places they looked so unusual that we were even having doubts. Are all of them roads? And while some of them were of a modest height of just a couple of meters, others would reach the depth of 15 or even as much as 20 meters deep, and all that is dug into the solid bedrock. Some of these streets appear to be much older than other relatively younger sections, and so it is very difficult to say how much are there actually of them, but from what we saw, it consists at least of a network of thousands kilometers of such roads. The ones we visited, they were north of Rome, on so-called Etruscan grounds. Basically that would encompass what we saw, let's say an area of 1,000 square kilometers. So when we would walk through the nature reserves or the places allotted for cutting wood or any other area that was not plowed or built on, there would be so many segments of such roads getting exposed from below the mud, or they were never covered with mud, or some of them end at sharp cliffs being destroyed by earthquakes or faults, movements of the earth. So some layers appear to be very old, while some of them much younger, but the overall density that we got the impression of would be that of the modern road network of Italy. And actually at many places the modern roads were built on such roads, so we could see the hewn walls on the sides, and just the bottom was covered with modern asphalt. At least many hundreds of kilometers are reused in such a way by the modern infrastructure of Italy, possibly much more, because how much can we see in 10 days? Of course, there is no proper inventory done as of the amount of roads by the modern so-called academia, because the full scale of these ruins, the roads and the rock dwellings next to them, are so much more than they should have been if the historic numbers of the population of supposedly the times when they were built were correct. That's why they're conveniently declared as mystery, and that, as we know, is the usual polite prelude before excluding them from any historic studies and ignoring them. Now, in modern times, sometimes we also dig tunnels or some sort of short passages to avoid obstacles on the roads we built, but this is not the situation with this network of roads. They are dug deep into the bedrock even when the terrain is perfectly flat and friendly for vehicles to travel on the normal surface of the earth without any problem at all. So digging roads, or in some cases even wide boulevards, in a solid bedrock, no matter how hard is the stone, is a lot of work. We don't even know why they did it. Were there dangerous animals on the surface of the earth? Or were they hiding from some sort of enemies that were bombing or irradiating with something from above? Or was it just too cold or too warm, so people resorted to withdrawing to underground to seek more moderate temperatures? Maybe they were covered on the top of these roads. Going underground is certainly a method that the tribal people use to deal with extreme temperatures. We still know very little about the rock cut roads because they have been denied study and attention. Denied study in the context that they should be looked at, which means as a part of this large network of rock cut roads stretching at least from West Asia, covering the entire southern Europe all the way to Spain. The only thing that I'm convinced of is that these roads actually are the transition between completely underground tunnels, like those that have been excavated in Turkey and also in Europe. We mentioned them in the last episode. And on land roads the way as we know them. And all this goes hand in hand with the rock cut ruins where the inhabitants who used and made these roads lived. Initially, for some unknown to us reason, they lived completely underground, and their streets at that time were tunnels as long as dozens of kilometers connecting the underground cities. But then, as they could live on the surface more and more, they didn't go directly to constructing on land roads, but first passed through the stage of the deep rock-cut roads. Although probably the network of rock-cut roads is most extensive in Etruria, in this area, it is not the only place with such networks. For example, in Spain, there are the so-called canals of medullas. Over there, they are labeled as Roman aqueducts, but they look exactly the same. That also consists of hundreds of kilometers of the same rock cut, whatever you call it. In Spain, they call it Roman aqueduct. Really, the Roman soldiers must have been very, very bored of their job at the army to dig hundreds of kilometers into the solid bedrock. Moreover, it looks like a hard variety of stone, at least from the photos. And all these rock-cut structures, let's call them like this, at various lands all over continents, are not connected only by the common idea that somebody was cutting for unknown reason roads in the solid bedrock. In Spain also, at Mecca, near Bocairent, not only the canals of Medulla, many others. So certain design elements also repeat each other. For example, when they had vehicle tracks on the sides, they would often be at the very edge of the road. That's the case in Israel and then again in Spain, everywhere. So it is hard to see a way how a cart, for example, would have used them because the wheel of the presumable cart that was presumably using this would get damaged by being rubbed on the sides of the road on the stone all the time. This is yet another example of reusing an ancient rock-cut road, this time from France.
And at Petra Jordan as well. There is just really a lot of these rock-cut streets, basically. Usually people are just shown the more recent and impressive, better preserved ruins at Petra. And those are fantastic, but what about the older stuff? There are entire streets where you can see the tool marks on the sides. rock cut with dwellings, and they do not try very hard to excavate these things. It's the same situation as in Italy.
People have become so superficial that they're not impressed by anything that is not screamingly fantastic and grabbing their attention immediately. What about the ruins that are not impressive because time has destroyed them? Look, there were rooms here. It is obviously a hewn stone. And at those older level of stonework at Petra, I mean, rock cutting has been going at just a mind-blowing magnitude and extent. Sadly, anything in the area of Petra that doesn't look Roman enough is denied study, inventory, or any publicity. And that is sad because probably just from photos it seems that many thousands of people lived in this actually probably a pretty large metropolis. And then in terms of the worldwide distribution of this type of rock cut roads, lately my suspicion is strongly growing that in North America the trails supposedly made by the first European settlers could have been actually a case of reusing an older rock cut roads. Why do I feel this way? First of all, there seem to be rock cut ruins identical in style to those of Europe and Asia. You can see them at megaliths.org. And then I found this road. The repetitive marks on the side are exactly as those of the rock cut roads on the old continent, and there are something what looks like rock cut chambers on the side of this very road. So I find all that very suspicious, and I hope that somebody in the near future will find time to examine this full area in detail. So we are always trained to associate these trails with the first settlers traveling in their wagons. But few things look suspicious. For example, this is part of the famous Oregon Trail. Just look at the cuttings on the side. I mean, the very idea of cutting a road into the solid bedrock is already a bit fishy, but it doesn't look cut for this purpose. At least that particular spot, judging from the photo, but I haven't been there in person. But still, I have read in forums testimonials of people who have actually been there, and they're wondering why at places the roots are actually knee deep. This is very uncomfortable for the animals that would supposedly drag a cart on it. You know, people say, oh, lots of carts were passing by, that's why they made such a deep trail. So what, they could get themselves together to dig such deep roads? I don't know what was the need of digging them so deep into the bedrock, and they cannot get themselves together to put something in the ruts when they become too deep so that their carts don't turn over? And then I noticed the same problem like with the European and Asian tracks, that the roots, supposed roots, alleged roots, are at the very edge of the road. That would be some sort of nightmare if you try to go with a car through such a road, because the axis, you see there are small protrusions in the middle of the wheels, they will get you stuck. Turning also would be extremely problematic on such a narrow road. Instead of calling the things with their real names, the mainstream historians have substituted the name of the ancient vehicle tracks with simply cart roads. Generally, people have bought into this idea because of their expensive suits and the titles, the shiny titles that they have. Some tracks indeed appear to be cart ruts in the sense that many cars could have passed here multiple times and have pressed them into the stone. This could be true, for example, for this Roman road. But in terms of the numerous trackways that are associated with the rock cut ruins, they appear to be of a different nature. Like, for example, these ones from Turkey are clearly pressed into the soft mud. And then that made me assume that at all locations where we have just fields of tracks all over, they must have been pressed into the soft mud. But then this image from Sardinia again made me wonder, if it was really so soft, then how come the dwellings below didn't give in and just the vehicles fell inside them? Maybe in this case the dwellings below were built at a later stage after the mud petrified. Because as we saw in the previous episodes, rock cut ruins were being cut for a very long period of time. And then to make it even more confusing, this multitude of tracks in Italy, they would then merge into a single one. Like this, or like this. And actually this was the usual situation in Italy, one single track running in the middle. It looked very much carved for the purpose of channeling water. And I'm sure that's the official explanation of it, but it only looks like that most of the time, not always. Sometimes it would turn into this and then go back to its simple form. Same like Spain and Turkey, by the way, where the regular marks appear and disappear for no apparent reason, just like that on the straight road. Robin in our group actually noticed that sometimes the tracks seem to split at the turns. So she suggested that it could have been something like a tube moving on one wheel, and then on the turns it would like go on one side depending where it is turning. Well, I don't know if there were trains, but if they were certainly not the way we understand trains. For example, they were capable of jumping and climbing stairs. And then at places, whatever trains or I don't know what it was, this rail in the middle, the channel was turning into what appeared to be human footsteps left in soft mud. And this situation where wide roads for the size of, let's say, a vehicle would turn into what looks to us like a pedestrian road with steps is a very common thing. I showed you a few examples in the Spain videos. Now this is in Israel. And actually, we don't know what is this channel in the middle. Maybe this on Roman road in England has some sort of similar function. And on this image from Israel, this on the left seems like maybe inside a road with something in the middle, maybe. Here, as far as we could see, the highway has become a riverbed. So this penguin trick of substituting vehicle tracks with cart ruts has done enormous damage and has confused normal people who would otherwise inquire what kind of vehicles were they, things like that. Instead of doing that, they're just trying to find a way how to associate the tracks with carts or other simple vehicles. For example, in a scientific book, somebody suggested that the single tracks, because in many cases we have only a single track, even in the fields, sometimes not only on these streets. So, according to a very learned penguin, that must have been left by some sort of a simple scooter. You see, people were driving their scooters many times over and over again out there in the fields, and so it got pressed into the stone. And if you don't yet feel completely confused about these roads or rocket structures, let me show you more how the tracks were also found on the walls. And not only the tracks that look as if left by tires or maybe sledges to be more precise were crawling on the walls, also these ones that belonged, according to our understanding of things, to something like an excavator, they were also crawling on the walls. So in North America, we saw some sort of repetitive marks on the side of the road. Of course, lots of in Spain and Turkey and so on. And here, as far as China, we see something similar. It's hard to say, but on the second photograph, maybe it even looks like that it is on a rock-cut road. Absolutely possible because we have a rock-cut underground cities in China, so possibly we had roads with the same models of vehicles. It would be nice to find out such things, but how? The Academia is really not good in presenting information about historic sites in a systematic way on a global scale. Everything should be regional and in a small box. Otherwise, it will just become obvious that people belonged to a single global civilization not so long time ago. And when they find that out, the reputation of the quackademia will of course evaporate overnight, but that will be the relatively small problem. The bigger one will be that people may stop participating in the centrally organized wars by those same who shout very loud on microphones about democracy and peacekeeping and so-called brotherhood, ironically. Now we call this a rock cut road. It's in Turkey. But since exactly in these areas the tracks were left in a soft mud, then actually we should call it mud scooped road. So were the deep roads in Italy also scooped away by some sort of machine? Now this mud scooped road is found on a field full of thousands of tracks going all around the so-called road. Then what is the need of having a road anyway? Or maybe these tracks around, were they like plowing the earth? Then it would make a bit of sense, like we have roads besides our fields and then we have a tractor tracks on the fields. But then the mud or the earth around doesn't look plowed very much. So this is how the roads, our roads of as the technologically advanced, look in that very same area of Italy, even in Rome, even in the center of Rome. So how come the allegedly much more simple people of the past would construct roads that are much more difficult to construct than our modern, and then they would have the resources to maintain them in a more beautiful shape than us? And the ancient roads were not only much more difficult to construct but also to maintain. Just think of all the big stones and other stuff constantly falling from the top. And what about if the people were not really that simple then in the past? And what if we are actually the simple ones? And it is only our sick belief system that has assured us that we are great. This is actually typical for every arrogant fool to consider himself great and most definitely superior. So let me tell you about our visit to Norcia. Officially labeled as one of the biggest necropolises, complex of necropolises in entire Europe. So we arrived at the location, this was the tourist board, and then we started walking and walking and walking. There were lots of thorns and lots of nature, but we had a map. There were no necropolises actually, but there were more and more thorns. And then finally we were lucky to again meet some people who were gathering mushrooms, and it turned out that the necropolises are actually a few meters away, but we can't see them because everything is just totally overgrown. So this is the state of affairs actually with the historic rock cut ruins in Italy. The official academia has been bought and sold by the propaganda departments so many times, so they are not much interested in historic sites. The alternative researchers, they are more interested in the history of the aliens. But what about the history of our race, the human? And so were these streets indeed cut in stone by the Etruscans, as the mainstream version is? It is possible that the last layers had something to do with the Etruscans, but definitely we also saw rock-cut streets in the older layers. And it doesn't even really matter if we label them as Etruscan or not, because we know very little about the Etruscans anyway. We basically know that these were a group of people who used an alphabet belonging very similar to the type of writing that was used by the tribes that were contacted and educated by the survivors of the old civilization, people who had some remnants of the old knowledge. Otherwise, the Etruscans did not seem to have been ethnically homogeneous group of people, because we see depictions of African Etruscans, Nordic-looking Etruscans. And in the survivors documentary, we saw that we see a similar cocktail mixture of races and ethnicities almost anywhere where the survivors left their imprint upon the culture. For example, Simon, our local guide, he had a reason of his own to think that the Etruscans must have been foreigners. Just looking at the unbelievable amount of work invested in cutting all these dwellings, chambers, and roads, kilometers, thousands of kilometers of rock cut roads, that is such an amount of work that he thinks that a real Italian with Italian blood in his veins could have never caused such a self-abuse, working himself to death in such a way. Why am I making all these documentaries? Does it even matter if this very old rock cut stuff is made by Etruscans or green dwarfs? By raising the public awareness that the stories that we are told in the history classes are nothing more than wild fantasies on historic topics. They only resemble the actual historic events, but just barely, just enough to make it look realistic.
So hopefully at some point humanity as a whole, not just individuals here and there, will decide enough of these historic fantasies and say, now I really want to know, where do I come from?
And most importantly, I really want to awaken people to the fact that, okay, so if they are serving me such shameless lies as actual history, then what about all the other information that they're telling me in school and in the newspapers and on TV? If they have been lying to me like this about history, can I also trust the news that I read in the mass media every day? Are the events that take place in those alleged news really taking place, or are they also wild fantasies connected to something similar that happened?
But humanity as a whole is not yet mature enough to go to this step, because basically for the common people, all the information that they gather all around is either from the mass media or from people who believe in the mass media. And that's how the common idea of what reality is actually formed.
And ironically, most people are convinced that this reality is based on actual facts, but it is not. It is by interpretations of facts and things that people have never seen, and they just believe it is there. And it is exactly this fear of stepping in the area of non reality that people consider as no man's land. That's what prevents most people from exploring the other options of realities that they can live in. Most people will agree, yes, my government lies to me, it censors the news, but still, those very same people will continue sticking to the general conclusions that they draw about the existence from the sum total of this news. And indeed, people have gone so much out of touch from the shamanic practices of their own forefathers that they will even think, are you telling me to explore other realities? That's craziness, that's insanity actually. And so man ignores the gentle whisper of the old prophecies. But still, eventually, he'll find his way to the land of peace of beauty where those prophecies are calling him, just on a different route. He will discover them by his own, and he will only find time to sit and think when one day he finds himself hungry and homeless. Because the wars of those faraway lands that were lingering for decades finally reached his threshold. And only then, when man thinks that he has lost everything that he has imagined had value, only then he will find strength within and will be brave enough to start facing what he has been considering dangerous subconscious realms. And brave enough to be honest with himself. And then things like this will start crossing his mind. You know what? Years ago, I voted for those politicians. I knew they were crooks and criminals. I knew that with the heavy taxes they forcibly take from me, they finance wars. And I knew that millions of people suffer horrific pain. But I didn't have any choice at that time, because I thought that's how life is. But maybe there are also other realities. Maybe it is even possible to live without being forced to harm others by so called external situations, or the nature around that we managed to ruin successfully as well, completely.
And only then will it cross his mind. He will think to himself, there were some people going to these old rock-cut ruins here nearby, and they were making some sort of ceremonies honoring the spirits of the ancestors. What kind of ancestors? Well, now that I've got nothing to lose, why not give it a try?
And that's how people will rediscover and start appreciating actually the rock-cut ruins. And they will start interacting with the ancient spirits associated with them.
And eventually they will figure out the main message left by the old legends, that nature all around is not dead, but each and every plant, and even each and every atom, every molecule, has a consciousness much like our own, and that humanity is meant to interact with that consciousness.
And that all events, like for example calamities that we say they come upon us, they seem to be beyond our control. They are nothing else but manifestations, gross manifestations of the subtle things, like the thoughts and belief systems of the beings that reside in this particular environment. And so gradually, man will start learning how to modify the reality around the surroundings using subtle means and not the direct mechanical approach we are used to nowadays.